South Africans embarked on a traumatic and divisive journey into their troubled past starting last year, when the Truth Commission began investigating the bloody secrets of the Apartheid era. The formula is simple. Torturers, killers and their political leaders are to come forward to confess their crimes. If they do so and are reckoned to have been politically motivated, they will be granted amnesty. Black liberation fighters who murdered opponents or bombed civilian targets also have to appear to avoid legal retribution in the future. For the victims, there is to be a recognition of their suffering and the humbling of their oppressors. By the end of the process, the slate is to be clean, the past exorcised. The reality, however, is fraught with problems as South Africans engage in this national therapy, confronting not the past 20 years or even simply the events of living memory, but an entire colonial history and culture.
2,000 years ago, the southern part of the African continent was inhabited by hunter-gatherer peoples, the Khoi and the Bushmen. Slowly moving down from further north in Africa into these parts were several groups of farmers called the Bantu. To the people of other continents, Africa was unknown, until the first European seafarers rounded the Cape in the 16th century and were met by very assertive Khoi people. In 1652, Jan van Riebeeck arrived. Africa south of the equator changed forever. Van Riebeeck established a refreshment station on the ideal halfway mark between Europe and the rich eastern trade routes. The halfway station soon became a colony, and French and German settlers joined the Dutch at the Cape.
Centuries ago, from war-torn Europe and bitter religious strife, they came from various cultures, languages, and persuasions to the southern tip of Africa, not to colonize or to exchange their merchandise in the first or the final place, but to become what is known as freeburgers.
The British, however, cottoned on to the Cape's strategic importance, and for many years the Cape Colony was tossed between the two colonial powers. The freeburgers' disenchantment with the colonial powers caused them to trek further east, where they first encountered and later clashed with the Xhosa people. The 18th century saw one of the greatest social upheavals in the history of southern Africa, the reign of King Shaka, who conquered and assimilated many tribes to form the Zulu nation. With the arrivals of the 1820 British settlers, the Trekboers soon felt that once again their freedom was compromised by the colonial government. When the government freed the slaves in 1834, it was the last straw. Piet Retief and others loaded their wagons and started the Great Trek north. They repeatedly clashed with the African tribes they met along their way. Die Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek and the Republiek van de Oranje Vrystaat were established in the mid-1800s. In the late 1800s, diamonds were discovered in Kimberley and gold on the Witwatersrand. Britain wanted the riches now in the hands of the Boer republics. It was time to hoist the Union Jack over the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. The Boers disagreed. On 11 October 1899, the South African Republic and the Orange Free State were at war with the British Empire. The Boers were devastated, in spite of a legendary and heroic effort. They suffered their greatest losses in British concentration camps, where 27,000 Afrikaner women and children died. Peace was signed in Vereniging on 31 May 1902. The Act of Union in 1910 brought the two Boer republics and the Cape and Natal colonies together under one flag.
This union entrenched European domination and effectively excluded the indigenous people from the political, economic, and military dispensation established under the Union of South Africa Act of 1910, adopted by the so-called citadel of democracy, the British House of Commons.
The years after Union saw both the formation of the Afrikaner Broederbond, initially a self-advancement organization, and the National Party. It also saw the formation of the first non-tribal national African political movement, the African National Congress. The two nationalisms started to square up to each other. The native question was dealt with in the Union's first parliament. One of its first steps was to deprive Africans of most of their land with the Land Act of 1913.
Having been overcome by the colonialists because of their superior weapons, mobility, and firepower, the African people correctly decided to resist the unholy alliance by setting up political organizations, drawing up petitions, organizing protest marches, as well as involving students and workers in strike action.
Their tactics were essentially peaceful. Two delegations led by Saul Plaatje to Britain to appeal to the British Crown achieved nothing to turn the tide of events. The symbolic Great Trek of 1938 marked an upsurge of Afrikaner nationalism. In 1948, the National Party won the election, and for the first time the cabinet under the leadership of D.F. Malan was constituted entirely of Afrikaners. As the Western world recovered from World War II and the shock of Nazism, they also recovered from the racist philosophies so popular during the 20s and the 30s. Not the Afrikaners.
There was a time when the whole developed world was guilty of the very same things of which the policy of apartheid was guilty.
When bright young Dutch immigrant Hendrik Verwoerd took over the leadership of the National Party, he turned apartheid into an ideology interwoven with their strict Calvinist religion. His laws required all South Africans to be classified according to race and to live in racially segregated areas.
It remains, however, a sad fact that we have to admit that the historic struggle of the Afrikaner for freedom and self-realization did not bring about the sensitivity that was needed in order to understand the same motivations and concerns when they came from black people. Perhaps the worst of our past was that we never knew each other.
The 1950s saw widespread resistance against the carrying of passes, a document which severely restricted the movement of Africans in the country of their birth. Hundreds of thousands of people were jailed for not carrying a valid passbook. In 1952, the ANC launched a deliberate campaign of civil disobedience, the Defiance Campaign. The organization gained momentum as a mass movement. In 1955, it was the nucleus at the Congress of the People where the Freedom Charter was adopted. This historic document wanted freedom and democracy for all and declared that South Africa belonged to all its people, white and black.
The Africanists opposed the Freedom Charter because it diluted the true nature of the struggle. The Charter opted for multiracialism as opposed to genuine non-racialism. It attempted to transform the struggle from one of national liberation to one of integration. The Africanists, faced with this change of policy, decided in 1959 to form the Pan-Africanist Congress as the custodian of the principles enshrined in the 1949 Program of Action.
Ironically, in the same year in which the Freedom Charter was adopted, the African population of the mixed suburb of Soweto was removed to meadowlands. In 1960, when the Union was celebrating its 50th anniversary, Verwoerd withdrew from the Commonwealth and declared South Africa a republic.
Wat ons gedoen het ons vir Suid-Afrika gedoen. En ons verdien daarvoor geen lof nie, want daar was geen ander keuse.
Black resistance in South Africa during these years were partly inspired by the spread of Uhuru in the rest of colonial Africa. By the mid-60s, many African countries had cast off the colonialist yoke and became independent states. The PAC organized a massive protest against the pass laws on 21 March 1960. In Sharpeville, police killed 69 demonstrators. This event rocked the country and focused international attention on South Africa. It also marked the start of its isolation. The government responded to the outcry by declaring a state of emergency and passing legislation banning the ANC and the PAC. After much debate and agonizing, the ANC decided to change strategies to include limited armed action.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against the government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
The PAC formed POCO, and the ANC created Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation. Leadership went underground. But the National Party had these fledgling liberation armies outmanned and outgunned. Nelson Mandela was arrested on August 5, 1962. Not long after, the rest of the ANC leadership was arrested at Liliesleaf Farm in Rivonia. All were sentenced to life imprisonment. The ANC and PAC leadership were now in exile or in jail. It would be another decade before the monolith of apartheid began to crack.
Op 31 Mei 1966 is die land opnuut geklee in 'n feesgewaad. Die herwonne vryheid is nou 5 jaar oud. 'n Vryheid wat nie sonder moeite verwerf is nie.
This land has indeed been acquired by blood and sweat and tears. All shall not be in vain. The spirit of tenacity of our forefathers is still ours. We are a virile nation. Our young men and women will be in the vanguard of any struggle for existence the future may bring. We have no fear. We love South Africa. This is our land of hope and glory. We shall not fail her or any of those who depend upon us. Be of good cheer. The will to win through is there. We could not do otherwise. We have no other country, no other home. Here we shall stay, whatever the cost.
Still, apartheid was not complete.
The issues that we debated deep into the night centered on the question of how we could come to grips with this changing world on the one hand, and yet retain our right to our own national self-determination on the other. How would we avoid the chaos that was sweeping much of the rest of Africa, that was depicted in horrific photographs of refugees fleeing from the Congo or Angola, and yet ensure justice and full political rights for black and brown and Indian South Africans? The solution that we then came up with was separate development.
I have just announced in Parliament details of the granting of self-government to the Transkei. The Transkei is the first Bantu homeland which has approached the government of the Republic to aid it by means of this great step on the road to independence, for which in its final form it rightly feels it is not yet ready.
It is indeed an historic hour that we are experiencing, as within the hour the Republic of Transkei will be born. It is given to very few to be present at the birth of a new state.
The policy of separate development had clearly failed. Instead of providing a just and workable solution, it had led to hardship, suffering, and humiliation, to institutionalized discrimination on the basis of race and ethnicity.
White South Africa went into deep shock when apartheid's greatest philosopher, Hendrik Verwoerd, was stabbed to death in Parliament in 1966. His successor, John Foster, successfully kept the lid on resistance with bannings, detentions, and imprisonment.
As far as the government of South Africa is concerned, as far as my colleague, the Minister of Police, is concerned, as far as the Commissioner of Police and the South African Police Force is concerned, the breakdown of law and order in South Africa will not be tolerated under any circumstances whatsoever.
But a new generation of leaders and activists began to emerge in the early 70s. They were also inspired by the success of Marxist Frelimo in Mozambique and the MPLA in Angola. The giant of this period was Stephen Bantu Biko, leader of the Black Consciousness movement.
Any changes which are to come can only come as a result of a program worked out by black people. And for black people to be able to work out a program, they need to defeat the one main element in politics which was working against them, and this was the psychological feeling of inferiority.
His murder in 1977 caused another international outcry and further isolated South Africa from the international community.
Time will arrive when South Africa will have no option, small as it is, to say to the world, so far and no further, do your damnedest if you so will.
Simmering black resentment exploded on June 16, 1976, when police opened fire on protesting school children in Soweto. The protest spread countrywide and lasted several months. Hundreds of young township men and women left the country to join the ANC in the neighboring states. It was a massive injection to the ANC.
The apparent involvement, in fact, I should say definite involvement of international communism within the South African crucible, was a major inhibiting factor which determined Afrikaners' reactions to this conflict. This brought a religious dimension to the perception of the Afrikaner that he had about his battle in Southern Africa. This ideological dimension introduced an element of fanaticism to the Afrikaners' resistance against change.
Minister of Defense P.W. Botha became president in 1979 after B.J. Foster resigned. The South African Defence Force stepped into power with him. Botha initiated a period of reform which included the scrapping of many apartheid laws, including the Mixed Marriages Act, the Population Registration Act, and influx control. His creation of a tricameral parliament, which excluded black South Africans, gave birth to the United Democratic Front in 1983. It was the most effective internal resistance ever. The townships soon became ungovernable.
The vehicle that the government established to implement its then total strategy and to coordinate the activities of all branches of the government in response to what it viewed as the total onslaught was the national management system. This inevitably led to the politicization of the role of the security forces and their involvement in civilian administration.
Successive states of emergency created an environment where secret units of the security forces flourished. Units like the shady Civil Cooperation Bureau and the police death squads at Vlakplaas were formed.
However, I'm now quoting, however, far-reaching security legislation and the state of emergency, with the suspension of many normal legal protective measures, also created circumstances and an atmosphere which were conducive to many of the abuses and transgressions against human rights, which forms the basis of the Commission's present investigations.
P.W. Botha suffered a stroke in 1989. He was succeeded by Frederik Willem de Klerk. De Klerk was faced with this choice: more radical reform or more radical repression. He chose reform.
Tomorrow will bring us to the end of a long chapter. What I've announced today was started by my predecessor a number of years ago. Since the moment that Mr. Mandela met him at Tuinhuis, and since the moment that in that discussion Mr. Mandela clearly stated his commitment also to peaceful solutions, it has become a certainty that he would be released.
The process gathered its own momentum. After 3 years of negotiations, South Africa had its first real election, and on May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as president.
The time for the healing of the wounds has come. The moment to bridge the chasms that divide us has come. The time to build is upon us.
The Truth Commission is an essential part of the structure of Nelson Mandela's bridge, a means by which ordinary South Africans can find a common bond between the oppressor and the oppressed to find a common purpose in the future of the country. The Committee on Human Rights investigates gross human rights violations. The Committee on Amnesty considers amnesty applications from perpetrators who must make a full confession and show that they received orders from a political party. At the heart of truth and reconciliation in South Africa is Archbishop Desmond Tutu.
We believe that our country has taken the right course in the process of healing to hear these stories.
Monica Godolozi, Elizabeth Hashe, and Nomali Galela are the widows of 3 leaders of the Port Elizabeth Black Civic Organization, the men known as the PEPCO 3. During the early 1980s, Kwakwahuli Godolozi, Sipho Hashe, and Champion Galela became targets of the security forces, and their families suffered continuous harassment. They last saw their husbands on the 8th of May 1985, when the PEPCO 3 mysteriously disappeared. They now accept that their husbands must be dead.
I never buried my husband. My wish is that since they killed him and his friends, I would like the Commission to investigate where they were killed, how they were killed, and why they were killed. We'd like to know the killers. The killers should come forward to confess that yes, we killed them. We killed them. I'm asking for assistance. I've never liked doing that. I'm a proud person. I still don't like it. Now I would even ask for assistance from my enemy. I would like the Truth Commission to assist me. I would even like the Cox evidence to be followed up, because I would like these people to reveal the whole truth.
Vlakplaas. Until recently, the base of the police counterinsurgency unit. For 13 years, Vlakplaas killed and assassinated anti-apartheid activists. In May 1985, an Askari, a former ANC guerrilla that was turned by the security police, received an instruction from his commander.
The Klerk gave instructions that we should go and help Port Elizabeth police because there were some chaps who were making Port Elizabeth ungovernable, and those people had to be eliminated.
The people who had to be killed were 3 United Democratic Front activists: Nwawoli Godolozi, Sipho Hashe, and Champion Galela. They led the Port Elizabeth Black Civic Organization, the so-called PEPCO 3. In March 1985, they had organized a 3-day stay away in the Eastern Cape. Their campaign played a major role in making the region ungovernable. On the 8th of May 1985, the PEPCO 3 disappeared. They were never seen again. To this day, their disappearance has remained a mystery. But now, Joe Mamasela has decided to talk. For several years during the 80s, Joe Mamasela was based at Vlakplaas. He says his job was to kill anti-apartheid activists. How many people have you killed as a security policeman?
Well, as an individual, it's hard to say how many, but collectively we killed between 30 and 35.
Why did you kill these people?
It was instructions from the head office, it was instructions from my immediate commanders.
And people like the Cock?
People like the Cock, and if you don't do these killings, they kill you.
His commander in 1985 was Colonel Eugene de Kock. He is now on trial in the Transvaal Supreme Court on more than 100 charges, ranging from murder to fraud. The story of the disappearance of the PEPCO 3 starts on that day in May, when they received a mysterious phone call from a so-called British diplomat who had to be fetched at the H.F. Verwoerd Airport in Port Elizabeth.
In 8 May, my husband came home with Mr. Hash. They were from their offices. He was carrying food so that I can prepare that for him. And he told me that they have to rush for the airport for the British consulate.
A baggage handler at the airport saw the men arrested by the police and taken away.
I was looking through the window. It was a big window. You could see well through it. There were the police. They were in 2 groups. Then I saw the police. They were wearing the camouflage uniform. He put Godolozi in the police van and his friends in another van. They also drove away in Godolozi's van.
Nothing was ever heard of the 3 men again. Police said Norman Fezzi had lied and that the Pepco 3 had probably left the country.
What happened there was we went to Port Elizabeth security police. We were briefed by the security police of Port Elizabeth to a certain extent that a certain Tozamile Porter was phoned by this Pepco 3 and they wanted some financial help from him. And this Tozamile Porter reassured them that he will contact his British contact, a certain Mr. Charlson, if I recall the name well, who will pick them up with finance. And the security forces have packed their telephone and they intercepted that message. And one of the security forces, an English-speaking guy, after some few days, he phoned them back and he phoned the Pepco 3 and he pretended to be Mr. Charlson. And he told them that he was at the HF Wood Airport and he cannot go to the township. He does not know how to go there. He will get lost. And these people told him, assured him that they will come and pick him up at the airport.
According to Mamasela, the Pepco 3 were driven to this old police station outside Cradock. It was known as Post Chalmers.
They were driven there. They were put into what we call an animal shed. It's like a big, long garage. They were put there for the evening, but they were interrogated first. And the first thing in the morning at about 9 a.m., the joint security forces of Cape Town came in. That was Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, and Klerk. They just came in there and they started interrogating these people. And the first person to be interrogated was Sipho Haisha.
How were they interrogated?
It was brutal. It was what in Afrikaans people call broekskeer. It was terrible.
Were they tortured?
They were tortured severely. They were savaged. They were brutalized.
What was your role in the torture?
My role in the torture was to strangle them and stifle them so that they couldn't make enough noise, because there were some neighboring farmhouses nearby. So we carried out our instructions, but
were they eventually killed?
Lieutenant Nivot beat them up with an iron pipe into their heads so severely that they were kicked, they were punched, they were stomped, they were jumped over their heads, and they were killed. Yes, they died. They died one by one. It was terrible. I've never seen anything like that in my life. It was a blazing hell on earth.
The 2 security policemen implicated by Joe Mamasela in the disappearance of the Pepco 3 are Colonel Rolf Venter and this man, Colonel Gideon Nivot. He refused to be interviewed this week, but said in a statement from his lawyer that he was in no way involved in their disappearance or death. But, says a senior military officer, I conducted operations with Nivot.
Gideon Nivot worked in an operation that I was the coordinator of in 86 onwards in the Eastern Cape. Their total brief was to go out at night to pick up known individuals involved in the United Democratic Front or the alternative leadership structures. They would kidnap or abduct middle of the night, kick down doors, take the individual they want, take him back to the complex, and then interrogate him up to the 3rd degree.
What do you mean by third degree?
Well, we made use of half drownings, electric shocks, tubing, favorite term. That's where you step somebody's face into the inner of a car tire and basically suffocating.
And what was Gideon Nieuwoud's role in this?
Gideon Nieuwoud was the senior operator of the police contingent in this combined operation. I was on Bryce where some of the teams were still busy with the subject. We will have a social gathering on this side, and then you can hear somebody moan in another room.
Gideon Nieuwoud is now on trial in the Port Elizabeth Supreme Court for murder.
Mrs. Cornelia, Cynthia Ngewu, Irene Kingwa, and Eunice Mia, 4 of the mothers of 7 young men who were shot dead in Gugulethu 10 years ago, still don't know the full truth behind the death of their sons.
But the worst part was to actually see this in the newspapers and the TV, where we saw our children lying on the ground.
Early on March 3, 1986, 7 young men were shot dead here in NY1 Gugulethu. The police say they had received information of the planned attack and laid a counter-ambush. According to the police, 7 youths in a white minibus opened fire with small handguns and an AK-47. They also threw a hand grenade. The police retaliated by killing all 7. At the inquests, witnesses testified that one of the men was shot with his hands up, as though surrendering. Another was killed as he lay on the ground.
If somebody puts his arms up, he's actually giving up. He's giving himself up. And he says that I am defenseless. And no policeman came to me to tell me anything. I saw it with my own eyes on TV. That's the time I collapsed. There was not even one policeman who came to inform me about this.
At the inquests, even less was understood.
What I saw at Whiteberg, Afrikaans was spoken a lot and there were no interpreters and we could only hear here and there. We didn't really understand what was happening because of the Afrikaans that was used at the time. We didn't even know who were the people discussing all these. We had no interpreters. We didn't have interpreters to know what is going on here, to help us with this.
The anger and anguish of not knowing what happened remains.
And why did the Boers kill everyone? Couldn't they just warn them? Or even kill, or even shoot them on their legs just to save their lives? Didn't these Boers have any feelings at all? Why did they just kill everyone, absolutely everyone? Not to leave even one to give witness. Now nobody knows the real story.
The clearest element about the Gugulethu 7 massacre is its murkiness. What we do know is that of the 22 police involved in the operation, some have taken responsibility for some of the deaths. But whether police shot and killed the young men has never been the issue. The question is whether the massacred men were part of an underground ANC cell and whether there was a calculated strategy to take them out. Last November, we spoke to a man who claims that he was the MK-Kader who got away.
The helicopter was looking at me because I was the one who escaped from that scene, but they couldn't even find me.
He does not want to be named or known until he has spoken to the Truth Commission.
Our unit, it was started 1984. Our vision, it was to be trained and defend the people on the ground. And the commander of our unit, it was Ali from Misha's Plate, a colored guy. He used to come and train us with the AK and the hand grenades. So that's why we decided, to try to hit this big target of the officers of the SAP police.
The police have testified that they got wind of the police bus attack from 2 informers who had infiltrated the cell.
When were you given a description of the Askaris from Flag Plus who were with these men?
As far as I can recall, we weren't given any description. We were just told that there were 2 informers with the group and they would be moving with the group.
A fortnight before the cell's planned attack on the police bus, 2 men joined their group. They said they were former MKKers, that they would assist with the mission and supply them with arms.
I said, okay, no problem, because they're having their weapons. We also, our side, we do have our weapons, but they came and then they told us that they're going to also assist us with the ammunition. So they done that, they gave us like grenades.
We need to know whether police were simply to prevent the attack. And what exactly were the instructions to the assembled police at Wingfield in the early hours of that fateful day? To arrest or to wipe out what they already knew was an underground ANC cell.
We were informed that information was received that an attack was to be launched on a police bus which was transporting police staff between Bellville and Guguletu police stations at the intersection between NY1 and NY111 at Guguletu between 7:15 and 7:20 that morning. We were told to prevent an attack and attempt to arrest the attackers.
That's what they all say. They also say that the massacre was an act of self-defense after a hand grenade was lobbed at the Fort Cortina, Klein and others were travelling in.
The next minute, the hand grenade exploded approximately 3 meters away from me. In the explosion, a whole lot of sand and dust was strewn all over me. A shooting pursued almost immediately thereafter.
The story of pure self-defense against a group of super-armed men just does not hold. Eyewitnesses have testified about some of the deceased being shot at point-blank range. This is borne out by Dr. David Klatzo, an independent forensic expert who testified at the trial of Cape Times journalist Tony Weaver.
Very unlikely that the ballistic patterns that I saw and I reported on would have been a general wholesale shootout. There were some of those wounds which were clearly the wounds inflicted at close range. Now, if somebody's shooting at you, you don't snuggle up to him in order to dispatch him. Okay? You shoot from a distance. So I have some difficulty with that version. And that is the photograph of the post-mortem photograph of the body with the peculiar marks across the small of the back. That, in my view, is an entrance wound. It has every characteristic of an entrance wound, and that has every characteristic of the mark made by the muzzle flash of the weapon as it's discharged at very close range. These, incidentally, are shotgun pellets in the same individual, in a variety of wounds that each individual sustained. If one looks at the tests that I conducted using pigskin, one can reproduce the marks using a similar weapon, and one could probably have become more exact on one's reproduction of the marks had one used the same weapon. The third one of great interest is the man who became known as Wadman. And the reason he became known as Wadman was because embedded in his brain was the wad of a shotgun cartridge. That's a shotgun cartridge. He was also very interesting in that if one saw that he had the angle of his jaw had been blown away completely, with blackening around the edge. It was a jagged wound around the angle of his jaw. And that again is consistent with a shotgun fired at very close range. The ballistics experiments which I performed at the time were shown, and one can reproduce that damage to the pig's jaw with a close range shot within a few centimeters of if the muzzle is closer than 10, 15 centimeters to the jaw, one can get that kind of result with the blackening that was all too apparent on the photograph of the deceased.
It is clear that the police are lying about the exact aim of their operation. Through the Askaris, they knew of the cell's existence and did not try to arrest the group before or later. The Askaris also provided weapons to the young guerrillas. The police shooting spree on March 3rd was excessive. The picture is of men fleeing, being shot down, and then being finished off at point-blank range. And then there is the secret message sent to arch-assassin Eugene de Kock a day after the massacre. All these bear the hallmarks of a more sinister puppet master, the Vlakplaas death squads, designed to eliminate activists and cadres.
On Saturday night, a bomb exploded in the house of an Anglican priest and anti-apartheid activist, Father Michael Lapsley. He was seriously injured. The house was extensively damaged, the ceiling blown off and property destroyed.
I came upon this manila envelope that had been among the accumulated mail. I opened it and it was addressed to me, and inside were 2 religious magazines, and the magazines were wrapped in plastic, sealed in plastic. So I ripped open the plastic. I took out the magazines, both religious, one in Afrikaans, one in English. I put aside the Afrikaans one. My Afrikaans is not very good. And I opened the English magazine, and the act of opening the magazine was the detonating device for a bomb. I can still remember what happened. The actual explosion, it's still something with me. I remember pain of a scale that I didn't think a human being could ever experience. I remember going into darkness, being thrown backwards by the force of the bomb.
I saw Michael 3 days after the bomb in the hospital in Harare. It was an awful sight. His face was charred and blackened. His beard had melted into his skin. His face was swollen to twice its normal size. In fact, the only way that I could recognize him was by a single gold filling, which he has in his teeth. Both of his hands were taken off. He needed to hold his stumps up all the time because anything touching them caused him the most extraordinary pain.
But why was this Anglican priest such a threat to the former South African government?
My conclusion is that it was my theology that in the end was the threat, that part of my work was the work not just of mobilizing, but unmasking the claim of the apartheid regime in any sense to be Christian.
In a funny sort of way, for me, forgiveness is not yet on the agenda. And the reason I say that, I've said that I'm not filled with hatred or bitterness or self-pity, nor that I want revenge. I think what I believe in is not retribution. I believe in restorative justice. Not retributive justice, restorative justice. And, for example, if FW was to come to me, or the person who made the bomb was to come to me and said, I'm sorry for what I did, and I want your forgiveness, and this is what I am now doing in the way of reparation, not to me personally, but to our country and our people. These are the kinds of things I'm doing to heal our land. Then, of course, one would say, of course, yes, forgiveness. There would not be a problem about that. But I haven't heard from de Klerk one word of remorse. I have not heard one acknowledgement of evil at all. And I've heard very few voices coming from that community of perpetrators showing any sign of remorse or sorrow or willingness to make reparation.
I give thanks to God. I give thanks to God for you, Michael. Thank you.
The National Party submission was the most eagerly awaited, as it formed the government during the entire period covered by the Truth Commission. Its leader, F.W. de Klerk, was also the last apartheid president. De Klerk started off well.
I stand before you today neither in shame nor in arrogance, but deeply conscious of my responsibility. My responsibility to be open, frank, and helpful. My responsibility to present you with an honest document aimed at achieving a real understanding of the conflicts of the past.
But in the end, de Klerk missed a wonderful opportunity to come clean in the eyes of the majority of South Africans.
The revolutionary strategies adopted by the government's opponents blurred traditional distinctions between combatants and non-combatants. Consequently, the then government began to make use of unconventional strategies, which of necessity had to be planned and implemented on a need-to-know basis. In dealing with the unconventional strategies from the side of the government, I want to make it clear from the outset that within my knowledge and experience, they never included the authorization of assassination, murder, torture, rape, assault, or the like. I have never been part of any decision taken by Cabinet, the State Security Council, or any committee authorizing or instructing the commission of such gross violations of human rights.
This was not entirely the truth. For example, de Klerk's Minister of Law and Order, Adrian Vlok, knew of the Vlakplaas assassination unit and was a regular visitor at Vlakplaas parties. His Minister of Defense, Magnus Malan, knew of the Civil Cooperation Bureau right from the start. Again, during the press conference after his submission, de Klerk was not entirely truthful when asked why his government did not close down the Vlakplaas death squad when its former commander, Dirk Coetzee, spilled the beans in November '89. Coetzee was backed up by two Vlakplaas colleagues, Almond Nofemela and David Chikalanga. But de Klerk's government allowed Vlakplaas to continue their dirty business for 3 years between its exposure and its closing down in 1983 after evidence to the Goldstone Commission. In this time, Vlakplaas supplied large quantities of arms to Inkatha warlords and assassinated several more anti-apartheid activists.
Vlakplaas was also at a certain stage then disbanded when allegations became substantially almost eerie, you couldn't prove. You could no longer say that it was just rumors, and we then took steps as information came to the fore. The people who were involved in the assassination are before the courts. I can only act, and a government can only act on the best information it gets. And it can only use its normal channels to gather information. It is a problem, it was a problem, we didn't do nothing about it, we went about it in a way to reach a solution to find the true facts at all times. We never covered up.
De Klerk did add that information on specific operations by the former security forces will at a future date be put before the Truth Commission by a group of generals of the SANDF and the former police force. And he did say he was sorry.
Bengihlaziye